There's a lot more to it than just saying there's two skulls and they look similar. Why didn't these people build spaceships? You know, it's really not that simple. It's a far more complex story. Hello, I want to talk a little bit about recursion today and the evolutionary development of higher order thinking in humans. Now, the reason I want to talk about this is there are a lot of viral videos that talk about the potential for earlier advanced civilizations in the human species. That, you know, anywhere from uh, 15,000 years ago to potentially millions of years ago, depending on which channel you go on and what videos you look at. I have some issues with this, and I'm going to go into the science and data behind my counter arguments and why I don't believe that there, not only that there were civilizations in the distant past, but that there could not be, and why I think there could not be. And again, I'll give some dates of when I think the absolute limits for this are. We know that civilization, as we understand it, emerges during the last 12,000 years. You know, we have what's considered a proto-civilization in Turkey, modern Turkey, at Göbekli Tepe, and the pre-pottery Neolithic culture across that region. Certainly not just at Göbekli Tepe. There are now dozens of linked sites for this pre-pottery Neolithic culture in the Anatolian region. So I should very quickly say that the reason why this is considered proto-civilization rather than a full civilization is because you could consider the somewhat arbitrary definitions of civilization include aspects that we don't see as yet at Göbekli Tepe, and that includes, you know, very early farming. There does not seem to be farming, you know, agricultural processes at 12,000 years ago. There does not seem to be domestication of animals. There also is very limited evidence for a writing system. There is a little bit of evidence suggesting that they did have symbolic representation of some objects and possibly of some names or words. So they at least have a proto written language, perhaps, but we haven't seen a full written language. And could simply be lost. Could have been recorded on, you know, strips of leather, and it's gone. But we don't see that as yet. We also don't have we consider the compelling evidence for a hierarchical system with, you know, advanced trade networks and other kinds of civic offices within the system. Again, they may well have existed. You know, we can infer that there was some sort of order to this site and to, you know, how they were planned and structured. So it's quite possible there was a hierarchy and that there was a, you know, a fairly advanced level of social order. So at the moment it's considered proto-civilization, but I'm very open to the idea that we will end up calling Göbekli Tepe and the surrounding sites a civilization. Okay, but prior to that, we do not as yet have evidence for any other civilizations or even what we could consider proto-civilizations, right? The That's not to say that we don't see engineering and, you know, complex behavior before that. We certainly do. I mean, there's some much older structures, you know, sort of 20,000 or so years ago in Siberia. We have the remnants of a mammoth tusk structure. Mammoth tusk was probably, you know, covered in hides or something like that. So it would have been an enclosed kind of a circular construction made from these mammoth tusks and other materials. So again, that takes complex behavior, engineering. You know, it's a large scale project, but it's just not stone. So it doesn't preserve in the way that Göbekli Tepe has. But I don't think we should sort of dismiss it as being simplistic. It's just it's collapsed, you know. We also see very rudimentary wall building in the Mediterranean. There's a site there over 20,000 years old. It is very rudimentary wall building within a cave system. And, you know, there are some indications of, you know, complex use of wood, for example. Wood doesn't preserve well. So we don't get the kind of the permanent structures that we see from 12,000 years ago. And again, this is widely considered to be an aspect of roving hunter-gatherer societies, is that they don't tend to use large stones in their structures. Why not? Because they're not staying in one place. So why would you use large stones which are fixed in place if your group is going to move on every few months and be in different locations? So in those circumstances, you're much more likely to use things like bones, wood, leather, other, plant materials, things that are basically unlikely to preserve in the fossil record, but that are much easier to throw up at a new location and which you wouldn't care so much about. They're not so resource intensive. You don't have to put, the whole of your society to work on constructing them. You can just, essentially shape some wooden poles and put those up fairly quickly and easily, compared to, of course, shaping large megaliths, from hard stones and then trying to erect those. It's a completely different level of engineering and time investment. Again, makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Why build permanent if you're not going to stay permanently? So that is not to say that people couldn't have done that. These again, need is the mother of invention. So as a society transitions into new regions or new behaviors, new needs, they will meet those with innovative ideas. So we're not talking about the cognitive capabilities of people that lived just before 12,000 years ago. We're talking about the shaping of societies by the environment and the thinking. So that can be, cultural, religious, philosophical ideas that may reshape the way that a society behaves, or it may be environmental factors that constrain the movement of a group. That may even be a factor of coming up against other human groups and no longer being able to rove in the same way without battling some other group. So that could also be a driver for a group becoming more sedentary. There's a number of factors. Certainly environment is believed to be one of the dominating influences on the transition from hunter-gathering to agriculture and domestication. That becoming more sedentary, in some cases that can be reaching an area that has a lot of wild game and a lot of wild plants you can harvest, and not needing to move on, and gradually becoming fixed in place, and then needing to produce more energy there, and not wanting to move, which would lead again to agriculture and domestication. So we can see there's a number of routes to this kind of scenario, but these are all factors of whether you are a roving group or sedentary, not factors of brain capabilities. So if we go much further back, though, we can look at the story of the development of the cognitive functions in humans. And there is sort of 6 stages, some takes of this, as to the gradual increasing cognitive flexibility that we have as humans. And we can look at this in terms of recursive thinking and recursive behaviors. Now, recursivity is very interesting. It's the ability essentially for pre-planning and nesting ideas and for having abstract thoughts. So when we talk about nesting ideas, we can, as humans, we can think about thinking about thinking. You can sit and in your mind, you can think about what your friend is thinking, right? So you think they are thinking. You can even think that they are thinking about someone else who's thinking. But we can hold these ideas in our mind and take that for granted. But as far as we know, through all the kind of brain studies and neurological studies, we are the only creature on the planet today that has the form of recursive thinking that we do. That we don't believe that dolphins or dogs, cats, horses, or any of the other kind of higher mammals, although they are certainly very intelligent, we don't find evidence that they have the level of recursivity that we humans do. And that we don't think that horses are thinking about what other horses are thinking, right? So obviously, to be absolutely certain of that is difficult, but we don't see the same kind of brain structuring and the responses in the brain that we see for humans when we are using recursive thinking. So these are areas that have been analyzed in ways that our technologies allow us to, and it appears that we are unique, right? So when did that uniqueness arise? We can actually go right back to the beginning of the human story, and we know that around 2.5 million years ago, we find in the fossil record the first evidence of Homo-like hominins. Now, previous to that, there were ape-like hominin ancestors who basically were very, very similar to chimpanzees in terms of body structure, brain size, and behaviors, as far as we can tell. Certainly, they more better resemble chimpanzees than they do humans by a long stretch. And these early hominins don't appear to have any higher degree of recursive thinking than other animals. The initial use of tools is fairly early, but we've got to consider that the first tool use is really simplistic. If you think about it, it's not difficult to stumble on the fact that broken stones are sharp. You can simply put your hand on a broken stone by accident and cut yourself, and then realize that if it cuts your hand, it will cut other things. And so we know that these early hominins used sharp flakes of stone for cutting. Now, the initial manufacturing of stone tools in what we call the older one technique is more or less just smashing a stone and seeing if you get a sharp shard from it and just using that to cut until it's blunt and then smashing another stone. There's really very little thinking going into this, bar for the fact that sharp stones cut things. I need to cut things, therefore I will smash a stone and use a piece of that. It's a fairly simple loop. There's not a lot of pre-planning, foresight, not great stages of shaping tools. It's very simplistic, and it's within the capabilities of modern apes that we live alongside, is to utilize, things that they find in the environment that are useful, whether, sharp sticks, sharp stones. We see this, within the primate world today. Now, around about the time that Homo erectus arises, which is 2 million years ago, we do see a transition towards slightly more complex tools. There's a gradual increase in the choice of stone types, and over the next few 100,000 years, we see a movement towards better shaping of these tools so that they have some kind of better fit to your hand, and even aesthetic look to them, that they're better balanced. They are chosen amongst other types of stones and flakes for their superior qualities. There's more thinking going into production of these stone tools, and so there's a gradual increase. But it's really not till about 700,000 years ago that we see sort of a transition towards more steps in creation of stone tools. And interestingly, we know that around 750,000 years ago to 800,000 years ago, that there are some major changes in the genome of humans. We'll go a bit into that later, but there's some major changes, and we see a split in the lineage of what was most likely Homo erectus to produce several subtypes. And basically, these are the ancestors of modern humans, the ancestors of Neanderthals, the ancestors of Denisovans, and potentially ancestors of other now extinct hominin populations, the closely related populations. And these groups, particularly over the next few 100,000 years, that's about 400,000 years ago, again, there is an increasing of the number of stages in the development of their tools. So, they're now having to more carefully select the materials. They are shaping them through a multi-step process, and they're clearly visualizing an end product before they start making the stones. They're able to hold a plan and a vision of the object that they're trying to make, and they are being shaped to a specific type. They're also very likely passing on techniques to each other. There's some kind of communal learning and sharing of these designs, and these designs are spreading. So we can see that the cognitive function is increasing in these hominin groups. Interestingly as well, we see that around 700,000 years ago, well, a little bit less, perhaps, we know that somewhere towards 600,000 years ago or so, we've got the first symbolic representation that occurs, which is down in Southeast Asia. We have a kind of hashtag-like engraving on a shell at Trinil down in Indonesia. And so that's the first symbolic representation that we see engraved anywhere in the world. So we're now transitioning into a period where thought can be represented as abstract into the external world. The hashtag is an abstract symbol. We don't know if it meant anything to the individual that engraved it. We don't know if it just, it was just kind of just cutting, and it just cut these shapes. We don't really know what kind of thought went in that. We don't know if it was planning to make the hashtag symbol. We don't know if it was thinking that this symbol had meaning to it. These are difficult to attain from it. What we can say is that this is the first abstract symbol engraved anywhere. This is happening at the same time as this shift in the genomics and also in the increasing stages for tool production. So as we get through to about 400,000 years ago, I mean, there's very recent studies have shown that there is a significant leap in terms of the number of stages, and there's now about a dozen stages to producing the higher quality tools. And that these certainly require a relatively good degree of recursivity, and not only that, but they suggest that at this point we're talking about the communal learning, but also the passing down of techniques. So essentially schooling and skills being preserved over generations for these tools to become as complex as they are, that there is a greater social element to tool production that is happening. So there's an interaction. There's also the visualizing of multiple steps. There is this complexity, which we know is part of this recursivity increasing. So this is not fully recursive thinking. We'll come to that. There is certainly a level of abstract here that, to know that you're going to have to do X, Y, and Z to get through these stages, and you're taking in information from others. So you're learning in a kind of somewhat organized setting to gather these skills from those, the elders and others that have been doing this, and to preserve these, pass them on. There's an awareness of this, that we need to do this, and that there's a benefit to this. So this is becoming more evident in the record. And then at around 400 to 300,000 years ago, we're sort of transitioning to a period where recursivity is certainly playing more of a role in human behaviors. And we know that wood is being used. I mean, some of the oldest shaped wood is found going back to around 700,000 years ago, 600,000 years ago. In Africa, we know that there is, the shaping of wood to fit with other pieces of wood. No one's quite sure what the items that have been found so far were used for, but we do know that they are working wood and interlocking pieces of wood. And again, this shows a level of recursivity is underway, and also experimentation with new types of materials, that there's no doubt more wood than we would imagine that's rotted away. I mean, we find some very early spears from around 400,000 years ago, so we know that wooden spears are now in use. So shaping of wood for that purpose, so you got to turn the wood into a shaft and point, and so they're working these, and in some cases they appear to have been hardened in charcoal, so they've hardened the points. So again, these are multi-steps. So we're seeing this increasing signs of recursivity and neural flexibility and learning and social behaviors. So this is in the records. And as you kind of move through to 300,000 years ago, we know that we have another kind of a transition, which again relates to the genomics, underlying genomics, and that is a mixing of at least two distinct groups. We have one group of hominins or humans that was separated from the other by about 1 million to 1.5 million years. So they've been living as distinct groups. There is now a coming together between these populations, and it produces a new human population. A new, we wouldn't quite say to a hybrid. I mean, obviously these are humans and humans, but there is this mixing event, an admixture event. Now, this leaves the kind of formative or proto-Homo sapiens as an 80-20 mix between these two populations. We also know there's some brain changes occur at this time. And funny enough, it's now broadly agreed that the first recognizable Homo sapiens, and again, there's some question around what Homo sapiens means, but very early modern humans, archaic modern humans, Homo sapiens, depending what term you prefer, that they appear in the fossil record around 300,000 years ago. And that's been kind of identified mainly in skulls in Africa, particularly at Jebel in Morocco, the Jebel Erhoud and the Jebel hominins, who appear to have a lot of modern traits, a lot of modern human traits. And so they are now seen by most anthropologists as being the first kind of archaic modern humans 300,000 years ago, right? So this is an event that is coming out of a mixing. So we don't have this type of human before. This is a new type of human, new population of humans, an 80-20 mix between two groups that have been separate for a vast period of time, over 1 million years, and that this new offspring from this mixing has brain changes that are advantageous. So you could say it gets the best of both groups. And that this is the human that goes on to essentially populate the world. But initially, what we get is an increasing level of recursive thinking. So up to about 100,000 years ago, we still have some transitions in the brain, some changes in the brain. We begin to see this rounding of the skull, and we start to see, more of the modern characteristics that we have, modern humans have today. And we are also seeing a transition into use of more types of wood tools. There's glue making, and there's processing of animal skins, and so we're starting to see further additional social behaviors, tool workings, engineering. This is starting to increase. And then at around 100,000 years ago, we believe that that is where we have the kind of really important transition into recursive thinking that's far more abstract and closer, very close to the modern level of recursive thinking. So how do we know this? It's because then we start to see behaviors such as cave drawings and the ochre hashtag workings in South Africa that we have at in cave sites down in South Africa. We've got like the Blombos stones, and we see that also now over in, I think it's Uzbekistan. They have found arrowheads. So arrowheads require recursive thinking because you have to know that you need to create. You need to create a multi-stage tool. So it also needs, you need to have in your design a number of things. First of all, you need to know that you're going to create a shaft is going to need a point. The point has to be done in a particular way. You're very likely having to put some kind of feathering at the back in many of these. You are going to need a bow. The bow needs some kind of stringing. This is a complex tool that requires many stages and an understanding of how to use the tool, obviously, which is things like understanding kind of even wind speeds and direction and coordination. This is a very complex tool, and so we recognize that to produce and use bows and arrows, you need to have highly developed recursive thinking. Just as the ochre engravings at Blombos are multi-layered, so these are essentially grids on top of grids. So they are no longer simply lines in patterns, but they are embedded over each other. And it's this idea of embedded thinking that recursivity deals with, that we are embedding ideas within ideas. And so you have to do this with these engravings, and you have to do them with the bow and arrow. So at around 100,000 to 80,000 years ago, we have this transition clearly underway in the evidence towards fully recursive thinking. Now, clearly, this is still not advanced, or we'd think of as highly advanced technological engineering, but the underlying framework of cognitive abilities are now being seen in the records at that point. Within a few tens of thousands of years, we see another transition at around sort of 50,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago, perhaps. We find evidence for a more complex artwork appearing down in, particularly in Southeast Asia, on islands across, the sort of chain in Indonesia today. We find evidence of um, really representative artwork, showing real animals, showing things that are happening, people, and so this is a completely different kind of artwork to simply symbolic representations, hashtags and lines and shapes. These are actually representations of beings and doing things, so we are now cognizing imagery of ourselves and our behaviors into the artwork. So this is considered to be a transition to fully modern behaviors. Alongside that, there's evidence of domestication in that region. So there is a domestication of pigs. We don't think that those pigs were actually being domesticated for food, but appear to have been likely to have been pets, and that so they were being moved between islands with the sailing population. Now, it's worth mentioning that sailing goes back a very long way, and obviously, although it would have been developing and improving the skills of sailing may go back to over 1 million years ago. We have evidence for that for sites off at Socotra, off the coast of Africa, and also for in the well, the Mediterranean, so several 100,000 years ago, and of course in Indonesia, where we know that to cross these island chains, you need boats, and that Flores is inhabited by about 1 million years ago. So again, so there's evidence for sailing going back a long way. Now, skills to do with sailing and fishing are increasing, and we see again that's another area that we can see evidence in for this kind of increasing neurological flexibility is that we see in Indonesia early deep sea fishing at around 50,000 years ago. So alongside the artwork and the domestication, we also have increasing technologies like such as fish hooks and evidence of tools that would have been used specifically for creating vine ropes that we would need for producing fishing vessels and nets. These are appearing alongside it. So we have really a transition into a modern human behaviors and modern recursivity at around 50,000 years ago. With that comes the potential for civilization. So now you're at a point where, cognitively speaking, as far as we can tell, all of the key underlying changes, the genomic changes, have occurred, and the progression through the stages of recursivity have been observed, right up to where these people should have essentially the infrastructure, the underlying, cognitive infrastructure and scaffolding to do almost anything that we can do today. I mean, that's not to say that, brain changes in evolution just stops there. I mean, there are some minor changes that continue onwards, and some research suggests that we don't reach fully modern recursive thinking until about 30,000 years ago. But it's a fairly trivial difference. So essentially at 50,000 years ago, we're almost there. So there is the possibility, I would say there is the possibility of lost civilization within the last 50,000 years. So once we reach that point, there is the potential. Now, did it happen? I'm doubtful, because if you think about it, a civilization that existed in the last 50,000 years, I mean, we would expect to find some evidence. That's within a window of time where we find quite a lot of archaeological evidence for behaviors and societies in the past, and yet we don't see indications of an advanced civilization within that period of pre-12,000 to 50,000 years ago. We're not turning anything up that looks like that. Now, there is just about, I think, if we stretch, the possibility that humans going back to 100,000 years ago may have had the cognitive flexibility to create a civilization, but I think it's pushing it. We're not really seeing the supporting data in the archaeological record that would suggest that these people have reached fully recursive thinking. It's still in process. Certainly, really 80,000 years ago is kind of the earliest evidence for that. So we could stretch and say somewhere in the last 80,000 years that it would have been plausible that somebody or some group would begin to lay the foundations of civilization, that they could do it if the circumstances had arisen. Now, that's a big question. Did the circumstances arise? Why would they do it? Because this isn't necessarily just a natural unfolding of how humans behave, because we can look down in Australia where humans in dozens of different groups lived for at least 60,000 years in that same region. And none of those nations transitioned into a civilization. In fact, none of those nations even transitioned to using a symbolic alphabet to represent all their words and letters. That didn't happen. And this is dozens of different nations. It's not one group. And none of these isolated populations found any need to do that. They continue with their hunter-gatherer lifestyles. We also know the same in the Amazon jungles and stuff. There's regions all around the world where people did not transition in this way. So this is not some kind of baked-in thing with humans that we just form civilizations. It actually takes specific circumstances, again, needs that we have to overcome for civilizations to unfold, or contagion, contact with others that have civilization that spread an idea. These are the two ways that really a civilization will come about. Is there has to be some kind of kernel, a formative event that either there is a need or there is some kind of contamination, from another culture that then spurs a group on to replicate it. Okay, so by no means is it just a natural flow that we always are heading towards civilization. Who knows if modern, technological societies hadn't contacted the indigenous people of Australia or the indigenous people in the Amazon jungle, would they have formed civilizations even if we'd zoomed along another 100,000 years? We don't know that. They were in sort of a kind of a stasis where they didn't need to do more than what they were doing to live fairly comfortably, and therefore they didn't do more, right? So we really don't know that civilization is some kind of fixed outcome. If you just give humans long enough and you give them recursive thinking, that they will form a civilization. That is not really grounded in like objective reality. We can see that humans can live in groups for tens of thousands of years with fully recursive thinking and never begin the proto-civilization stages. Okay. Now, I'll rewind a little bit and say that, because people say, yes, okay, but, maybe it did happen earlier and maybe we're just not seeing the evidence. But there is another argument against this, and that is the underlying framework, the cognitive framework and the genomics that underlies that. Now, if we were just looking at brain size, and I've seen this suggested by a number of researchers, is that the brain size was more or less there for the last million years. And that in a recent discovery, they found evidence suggesting that the first Homo sapiens type humans may have lived 1,000,000 years ago. Looking at skulls down in East Asia and China, that this idea that perhaps these kind of initial Homo sapiens populations were already in place 1,000,000 years ago, and that our brain is approximately, finished by then, that we have probably the same size. It's not quite the case. It certainly is growing still. But I've seen this argument made. Now, I want to tackle that because what this misses out on is that you cannot just by looking at the skulls, like you can see there's a selection of skulls in the image behind me. You can see how the shape has changed over time. But you can't just look at a skull and say, okay, this skull 800,000 years ago is more or less within the size range of humans today, because of course there are quite a number of different sizes in humans today. We have people with very small stature who have smaller heads, and we have people with large stature who have larger heads. So certainly you could find people today with a skull and brain size equivalent to some of the the skulls and brains of people living 800,000 years ago, maybe even 1,000,000 years ago, right? So that is true. So to then say, okay, well, if they had basically modern human-sized brains then, why couldn't they just have done all the things modern humans were doing? Now, we've tackled that already in the way that we see the evidence unfolding, but there's more to that. It's because we actually know that underlying the shifts are genomic changes which are occurring across this time. Now, there's actually a burst of genomic changes around 2,000,000 years ago, which is when, of course, Homo erectus appears in the records. But these events kind of work as like domino effects. So there is a burst of changes where we get all kinds of shifts in, particularly in what's non-coding DNA. These are areas that control or code for expression, gene expression. So they're not genes themselves, but they control gene expression. And so when these areas change, they allow for massive restructuring in the brain. And we see that this is unfolding across the period from 2,000,000 years ago up until 800,000 years ago. And then we get another burst of activity, and then it's there at around 800,000 years ago. We see this divergence event with the ancestors of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans kind of splitting and going their separate ways and forming new populations, which of course more changes will unfold over time for all of them. But these are all large-brained humans that come out of some profound genomic changes at that point, so around 800,000 years ago. Clearly something very profound is happening because we start throwing out these new populations, these new lineages. We know that there is an awful lot of genomic modification underway at this point. I mean, our genus, Homo, begins with some profound modifications in the genome. And go back to around 2.5 million years ago. And we know that we have a gene duplication or partial duplication for SRGAP2C, which is really kind of crucial for the brain size expansion that's underway. And it also kind of promotes neoteny, which is the preservation of infant-like traits in adult stages of an organism, and it leads to higher dendritic spine density and enhanced connectivity in the brain. So these are all kind of things underway right at the beginning. At the same period, we have gene duplications for NO2CH2NL. Again, so this is a gene change that increases cortical progenitor pool delays in differentiation, boosts the neuron production in the neocortex. Again, there's a lot going on right at the beginning of our genus. At around 2 million years ago, with the emergence of Homo erectus, we have some positive selection on a number of coding genes. And these include ASPM, MCPH1, CDK5RAP2, CENPJ, and many others. And basically, there is selection on microcephalic related genes, so to the brain size and brain structure changes, which improve progenitor division and spindle orientation for larger brains. So there's a lot going on right at the beginning of the Homo erectus lineage. Again, we see a acceleration in brain size from 2 million years ago. And then this kind of expansion accelerates further. You know, we see this on the graphs where you can see the curve just accelerates upwards. And around 800,000 years ago, at the point where Homo erectus kind of diverges to the ancestral lineages for modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. And it's right there that we get some interesting point mutations on, for example, FOXP2, which is a gene very closely associated with language. So we know that this change enhances the production of speech, you know, the language circuitry, the synaptic plasticity, required for translating thoughts into sounds. That's all underway right at this point, so 800,000 to 600,000 years ago with these new populations. And then we have some accelerated substitutes in non-coding regions. So these are amongst what we call human accelerated regions. There's 3,000 of these, and these are areas of code in what were highly conserved areas of the genome. So across all the other mammals, these are sections that haven't changed for tens or hundreds of millions of years. And then in the human lineage, they've undergone huge acceleration, about 5x, 10x, 20x, in terms of the speed of changes, so point mutations. Now, there's some rapid changes in the enhancers that alter neurodevelopmental gene expression, both in timing and location, that are occurring in this period. Most of these have become fixed around 800,000 years ago, but there are still some that are undergoing major changes. We also have the human-specific conserved deletions, or H-condels. There's around 10,000 of these. And again, these are point mutations, or deletions, in fact, that have occurred in these highly stable regions. So again, where HARs are accelerations in highly conserved DNA, H-condels are point deletions in these regions. Again, there's about 10,000, and of these, a great many are related to the brain development, particularly fetal brain development in the human lineage. So these actually remove repressors, so areas of code that were repressing some positive brain changes. So they allow the brain to, they allow connections in the coding in the genome between areas that didn't previously connect. And so they remove these repressors and enable new enhancer activity near to connectivity and synapse genes. Again, so this is massive benefits to the brain. Right, so by about 600,000 years ago, most of these H-condels are, again, done what they're going to do. They're kind of fixed. And then we have the quickly evolved regulatory regions that are known as human ancestor quickly evolved regions, or hackers. The name's kind of telling there. They look almost like we've been hacked. And these are bursts of change that occur throughout the Homo evolutionary lineage up until about 600,000 years ago, when they seem to become basically, they're no longer active. So there's thousands of these, mostly overlapping HARs. So again, we know that they are related to the HARs, and they related, but they are quite different because these are novel. These are not changes in highly conserved material. They are novel. So these create novel enhancers in progenitors and support prolonged neurogenesis. So they are giving us this longer period of maturation of the brain, a lot of time for restructuring and new connectivity in the brain. This is coming out of these hackers. And so again, these seem to occur a little bit before 800,000 years ago to 600,000 years ago. So they are crucial for this period in which the various large-brained humans are diverging into their separate populations. Then we have the structural variants affecting the 3D genome, so folding the three-dimensional folding of the genome. So although there's been changes accumulating for a million years ago or so already, there are more of these occurring in the period up to 600,000 years ago. So these essentially are enhancer hijacking and chromatin rewiring for brain gene interactions. And so there's a great number of these that are accumulating changes over time. And then we have a partial gene duplication, RGAP2B or ARHGAP11B. So again, in the period of 800,000 to 500,000 years ago, we have this change that amplifies basal progenitors and drives neocortex folding. And you might have seen some experiments where they actually put a human version of RGAP2B into a monkey, and it had gave it a larger brain and different folding of the neocortex and this kind of stuff. So we know that it's a crucial brain gene change. And then we have a number of things that are happening between kind of in that period 800,000 years ago to 500,000 years ago. But then at about 300,000 years ago, we have a really interesting set of events because we have the first fossils that are associated with early modern humans. So this is the Jebel Irhoud hominins in Morocco that are considered to be the first, modern humans. So early modern humans at 300,000 years ago, not completely modern like us, not fully modern, but they are the product of a mixing with two different ancestral groups. We know that there are two populations of humans that have been separated, from interbreeding for like over a million years, and that they've come together and they have offspring. And these offspring have an 80-20 split between the genomic information they get from each group, and they get a number of brain enhancements in this process, taking the best of both groups, you could say. And there is also a point mutation that occurs 300,000 years ago, which is the TKTL1 single change that boosts frontal cortex progenitors and metabolism and is linked closely to enhanced cognition. So these are massive changes, clearly, and this is not the end of the story because we know that around 150,000 to 200,000 years ago, there is this restructuring of the brain and skull to give us this globular shape, and it's believed that part of this restructuring is again changing the way in which connectivity is wiring in the brain, and so it's not just a shape change; there's a structural change that has real-world impact on our cognitive abilities. The final stages of this unfolding, in my opinion, are happening around about 100 to 50,000 years ago, which is when we see, of course, the first symbolic representations in terms of, of recursive thinking with the Blombos caves kind of engravings, with the bows and arrows over in Uzbekistan. This is all unfolding in that period. And then at 50,000 years ago, we have, art that represents real people and animals. And we have, deep sea fishing and all these things. So we see that this is the end stages of the unfolding of recursion. And the really interesting things that is sort of mysterious about this is that there are some frontal lobe changes involved that must come out of a kind of a mutation of some sort. And to have fully recursive thinking, to be able to move to symbolic languages and symbolic art and all this stuff, you need to actually be exposed to recursion in infancy, in the first, I think it's the first 5-6 years of your life. So you have to be around other people that already have recursive thinking and recursive language so that you can develop it. Otherwise, the brain region that basically doesn't fire up, it kind of atrophies. So if you are like, we see this in feral children who were, raised without any interaction with adults. So essentially, sometimes either they've been grossly neglected or raised by animals. That although they can later on, learn language and they can have many of the regular behaviors of modern humans, they do not develop full recursive thinking and recursive kind of symbolic thinking, that it never unlocks, is atrophied. So there's a mystery here because who was around to unlock this ability in this first generation of children who had this frontal lobe change? Nobody really has resolved this problem. So we have a very strange situation where either a number of children all at once in a single generation had this novel mutation, which is very unlikely, and then somehow between them conjured up a way, some game or something that allowed them to unlock recursion, or something even stranger happened. That there's a non-human presence, an intelligence that is there when these mutations occur, these brain changes occur, and is coaching these infants with recursive thinking and language. Now, they're both very strange scenarios to be honest, and I don't really have an answer, but there's something very profound that occurs, and we can't just ignore this. So it doesn't seem that we are fully modern human until around 50,000 years ago. So for me, technological civilizations in the deep past are incredibly unlikely, if not impossible, for all the reasons we've tackled. Certainly, the evidence goes against them. But in the last 50,000 years, they do become possible. But we just, at the moment, we are not seeing the evidence for them having existed. And that's surprising because, obviously that's not the deep, deep past. We should be able to find some traces. Maybe that'll turn up. But for me, the evidence is against these really deep in history kind of civilizations. The last 50,000 years, absolutely, we should look for them just in case. But beyond that, I think the evidence goes really, really counter to this idea. And hopefully now you understand there's a lot more to it than just saying there's two skulls and they look similar. Why didn't these people build spaceships? It's really not that simple. It's a far more complex story.